Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Okay, thank you for coming to the talk today. We'd like to welcome Conrad Albrecht Buehler, if I pronounced that correctly,
Yep.
Who I met. I visited Northwestern, where he just recently got his PhD working with Don Norman and others, and I visited Northwestern about a month ago, and afterwards had a conversation with Conrad where I, just prior to his actually defending his dissertation, where I realized that the overlap of his interests and interests in groups here was very high. And so when I got back, I invited him to come, and he begged off on showing up until after he defended his dissertation on Halloween. But he did that successfully, and now he's here to talk about HEAD, which is a framework for situation-aware monitoring, and I think also some other things. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan. Thanks. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. So what I want to do is I want to tell you 4 user stories about monitoring and some of the difficulties that these people, that each of these people have. I'll discuss the situations that are important to each of them and how they each perform their various monitoring tasks. Each story is an example of a monitoring task that competes with many other responsibilities for these people, and is one for which alarms and dashboards don't always work. So the first story I'm going to tell you about is about monitoring servers, something that I think to some degree we all probably have a little bit of familiarity with. The second story is about monitoring business performance by reading financial reports. The third story I'll tell you about is about monitoring the user's experience in a discussion forum. And the last story that I'll tell you about is about monitoring for infectious disease outbreak at an animal shelter. And I'm going to try to make the case that alarms and dashboards are essentially incomplete. I'm going to base that on a distinction that I'll make that between monitoring activities that are analytical and those that are evaluative. In other words, those that try to reach an objective conclusion compared to those that try to reach a subjective conclusion. So let me start out by telling you a little bit about a CTO that I work with. He's the CTO of a small entrepreneurship, and the company's business is offering services online. So it's a very technical company, and he's in charge of everything technical there. He's the lead developer, and so he's created the website and most of the application that runs on it. He also has executive duties, which involve raising funds and doing interviews. But he's also the systems administrator for the entire company. That means that he has to build and maintain all the computers, including all of the servers. So one of the things that he monitors is the performance of the web, the database, and the mail servers. So to do that, he has these powerful server dashboards that give him a huge amount of information. Now, he ends up rarely using them at all. In part, it's because it's a lot of work for him to find what is relevant to him in these. I mean, they can be enormous. And they end up requiring quite a significant amount of sort of mental effort to spot and assemble all the data that's relevant to a situation that he wants to be aware of. So one of the other things that he has at his disposal are alarms and alerts to let him know that an incident has occurred. But he ends up filtering all these alert messages that come in and put them into their own mailbox, which he basically never looks at. He really only looks at them if there's been an incident and he wants to sort of try to trace back to try to figure out where its origin was. So if he doesn't really use his alarms and he doesn't really use the dashboards, how does he even know that something's ever wrong with his servers? Well, he's got 2 ways. For one, sometimes he'll get someone from his customer support team will come by and tell him that they're getting angry phone calls about people who can't access the site or can't do something on the site. So in some ways, he lets his customers do his monitoring for him. But throughout the day, he's also working with the servers. He ends up, applying patches, updating application code, and so on. And whenever he happens to be logged into the servers, he'll run uptime just to check the server's load. In essence, what he's doing is he's sampling the server load. And if he happens to catch it at a moment when the load is high, and if he has a little time, he might go investigate the situation and try to understand what's happening. So in other words, he's essentially asking, is the server load high enough that he needs to go investigate it? But high enough. What is high enough? That's a pretty subjective description. And what might be high enough for me is probably not high enough for him. Let's take a look at a quick graph of server load. So is the load high? Was it high? Is it now? Will it be soon? There are a lot of questions about how the server load is doing. Why doesn't he just set an alarm? Well, for one, we already know he doesn't really use them. But there's another reason. He wouldn't necessarily have time to drop whatever he's doing in order to go investigate why the server load is high. And when he does have time, an alarm doesn't necessarily tell him anything. It would just be silent if it's not high. So the problem is that this is what an alarm does. It divides the data range. It divides it into the data that he should ignore and the data he should attend to. Now, remember that he'd investigate if the load was high enough. An alarm just tells him that it's high. And what's more, it tells him that once it's happened, nothing at all before it happens. Now, the graph would tell him that a little bit more. He could see how it's changing. He can see where it is, where it's been, but it's at a cost. He has to interpret the graph. He has to spend time looking at it, trying to understand it. And then he's already dismissed using his dashboards for pretty much the same reason. And it also takes up a lot of screen real estate. And as we saw with the dashboards, that can balloon really quickly. So instead, what if we change how the data range is divided up from this to this? Instead of showing the whole graph, we could just show the region prior to the alarm threshold. Then the position in the region could identify the importance of attending to that situation. If the data is below the ignore threshold, it might as well be at the ignore threshold. If it's above the attend threshold, it might as well be at the attend threshold. And somewhere in between, it tells him how important it is that he might go look in on the situation. So I refer to sort of this range in between as heed, and it enables us to indicate this sort of degree of importance. And since our CTO wants to know when the load is high enough at that time, we don't necessarily need to show him the whole graph. We could just show him its current position in that range. And so now we could offer him a simple dashboard that relies on the way he already monitors his servers by looking at load, and one that doesn't give him too much detail and still will help him decide if he should turn his attention to those servers. And it does so continuously. So when he has time, he can quickly identify if at that time it's worth investigating. And by making this dashboard tiny, easily and persistently visible, he can evaluate the situation quickly and develop some awareness about how his servers are loaded, how frequently they get loaded, and so on. So, what ended up happening when giving him this little dashboard that we let him use for a few weeks. So he ended up learning quite a bit about how his servers typically perform, and it ended up increasing his confidence in their performance and in their operation. And he explained to me how it ended up being used to actually catch an incident that could have been a problem, but it wasn't his to catch. He had, since this thing was running in his office and his other developers go in and out of his office and meet with him from time to time, eventually enough had asked questions what this thing was, and he explained it to them. I didn't get to teach them anything about it, but he did. And he told me about one incident where one of his developers had walked by his office and appeared in, and he wasn't there, but the developer looked at the display and saw that the database server had a high heat, and it suddenly reminded him that, oh, he had left a database backup running, and it was the middle of the workday, so he ran back and quickly stopped the database backup so that the customers had more access to the site. So to some degree, that ended up showing that this was a relatively simple to interpret display and something that even his developer could use. And then the CTO explained to me how much he had wished he'd had this display several weeks before. They had gone through a major upgrade, and they had replaced the entire web application. And despite having done months of testing, once it had been launched, there were these instances where the site would just grind to a halt. And they would look in and they would see huge amounts, tons of processes running on the database server. The web server was getting bogged down, but they didn't understand why. And it wasn't consistent. It would just happen sometimes. And this was such a problem that he ended up having to dedicate himself and 3 of his developers full-time for 3 days, watching constantly what was happening on these servers in order to catch the moment when this problem began so that they could try to understand and interpret it. And how much he had said how much he wished he'd had a display like this to give out to everybody in the company so that everyone could be watching for a time when one of the developers needed to go look in and see what was causing this problem, when the load was increasing on all these things. Ethan?
Are you going to talk about longitudinal data? Like, one of the neat things about the chart that you had earlier is if you're willing to roll back and look at the logs, you can see that or you're watching the dashboard, you can see that historical trending. Mm-hmm. It feels like here I can say, oh, the database load is really, really high, mm-hmm. but I don't know that it's only very recently become high, or it's been high for the last 3 hours because I went and took a long lunch after asking the database to back up.
Right. That's a great question. I will actually get to that in just a moment. That there's essentially what you're asking is a person monitoring may actually care more about how something is changing than where it is, and so we'll get to that in just a moment. But it's also the way in which you actually ask the question is actually, I think, very telling. It's you're doing an analysis of what's going on. And a lot of people who monitor and monitor things, especially very technical things, will tend to do that. We want to understand what's going on. The only thing is that we don't have a way to identify when we should do that, and that's what I'm trying to cover primarily. So let me tell you a little bit about the next user. Deciding to investigate the situation with the servers with the CTO is a tactical decision, and it's one he may have to do several times a day. But what about problems and situations that you need to keep track of that happen far less frequently? So the CEO, she's the executive of a medium-sized business that also offers online services, and she's launched several programs to grow the business. And she needs to keep an eye on how those programs are performing. However, she doesn't need to look in on them every day, every hour. She just, once a week or so is enough for her to get a sense of how they're performing. But like our CTO, she has way too many other responsibilities and constantly sort of dealing with much more urgent and immediate problems. As a result, she forgets to check up on these programs and, in fact, told me that one time that she hadn't looked in on them for a month and a half only to find that they were underperforming tremendously. Furthermore, these programs carry a lot of anxiety for her. She's very worried about their performance, and actually, as a result, that only discourages her from checking up on it, a little bit of avoidance. So the way in which she monitors these programs is she reads these reports that are generated for her. And if the report shows that a program is not performing well enough or based on her expectations, she might go investigate and try to understand why something isn't, why users aren't signing up, or why they're not signing up faster. In many ways, this is a lot like our CTO's problem, except that the values don't change as frequently. They change a little bit every day. They change a little more every week. But as a result, since they're close enough, maybe we can apply a similar solution and just show her how close each of her clients are to being underperformers. Now, we could just show her these 4 indicators and let her know how each of the clients are doing. But what happens when this grows to 20 clients or 40 clients? we really want her to read the report and spend her time analyzing the report. So we need a way to sort of compact this display so she can just decide whether or not she needs to go read that report. So to do that, we can just assign some values to the heed range and just say, set 0 for the minimum heed and set 1 to the maximum heed and make it a scale. And now we can elect the maximum heed value and to represent the whole report. That means that instead of saying client M needs your attention, it says that the report needs her attention. And it also says that unless the whole program is performing well, she should probably go investigate the situation. So this is essentially an OR operation applied to these 4 heed values. Now she has a single representation that summarizes the report. And again, if we make it persistently visible, she can continuously evaluate the program's performance. Also of note, because we're just assigning these values to the extent of the range, we can combine data of any kind. It doesn't matter whether it's numbers of users or CPU load. We can simply combine them because we're just saying, how important is it that you pay attention? Furthermore, because we've sort of compacted this display in a sort of predictable way, we can enable her to delve into the situation, meaning that she can get an evaluation of the report, and then she can delve in and get a little more detail about to get sort of more detailed evaluation of the report, and then she can go and look at the very detailed actual report and raw data, which is essentially the sort of analytical process. So there's an evaluation that triggers the analytical process, and then there's this act of analyzing what's going on. So working with the CEO actually had very surprising results. The biggest surprise was, it was very surprising that when I would go to interview her after leaving the application running with her, she would tell me that she would apologize and say she hadn't used the display, she'd been so busy and had all these things going on. But when I questioned her about the performance of the program, when I questioned her even just about the position of the display, she knew exactly where it was. Despite the fact that she didn't think she was using it, she ended up using it. And the fact that it was this very almost passive interface was a really surprising result, something I certainly didn't expect. But the biggest surprise was the fact that it ended up reducing her anxiety over the performance of this program so much. It wasn't that the program was suddenly performing so much better, but she was aware of how it was performing. And she asked me to create many more displays for her, not because these were necessarily things that she needed to monitor, but these were aspects of her business that were creating a huge amount of stress for her. So she was looking at this as a way of decreasing her anxiety, which I thought was a very surprising result. So the third story I want to tell you about is about a community website owner. There are some situations that people monitor not because they're already familiar with them, but because they want to learn about them. This is one such case. Now, he runs a small website, well, about a medium-sized website now, which is primarily a large community-supported website where people can interact and inform each other, and it's largely just a huge forum. But he's also the primary developer for this site. He created all the software for it. He created the whole site himself. But the site runs on co-located servers, so it's not really his responsibility to monitor their status and know how they're doing. He's more interested in knowing what his users' experience is and trying to make sure they have a good one. So the thing he's looking out for is if they're having a bad user experience. And he talked to me about 2 types of negative user experiences he was trying to look out for. Something that restricted access to the site for his users, and the discussion on the site becoming what he called unbalanced. So let me start by telling you a little bit about the access restriction problem that he saw. So since he's the sole developer, he's frequently changing the site. He's changing the site code. And he told me about this instance where he had made a small typo, essentially, in the code, and a subset of his users couldn't log in. And at a different time where a subset of his users couldn't post to the forum. And so he was trying to monitor for this happening again. The way he found out in the first time this happened was he happened to be talking to a friend of his who's also a forum member who then told him, oh, I haven't been able to access the site for a few days, is something going on? And he had just had no idea. Even though all the data about the numbers of people logging in, the number of people posting, the number of people replying, were all was data that he actually, in theory, had access to because they were part of the sort of Ruby on Rails framework that he used to create the site. But the only way he really had of seeing this data and querying it was through SQL queries. And he had enough other things to do that wasn't something he'd end up looking into. So what he wanted to know is if he'd done something else that ended up reducing the ability for people to log in or reducing the ability for people to post or reply. But the thing is that there might be a day when there's a lot of people posting, it's been a day where there was a lot of, some national event happened to which everybody had an opinion, and so there was a hot topic and everyone was replying, or there was, it was a day after a holiday and everyone was talking about something that was important to them about the holiday, and so there were many new threads started. So, yeah, he doesn't, it's not that he cares that neither people are not posting or replying, it's that he cares that people are neither posting nor replying, not just one or the other, which is essentially an AND operation of those two. It's not a logical AND, which would sort of try to pick the minimum of the two values, but it's a compensatory measure instead. Because people not posting doesn't mean that they can't post, so maybe he should look in on the problem. But if they can't post and they can't reply, he definitely should look in on the problem. Now, this issue of monitoring for unbalanced posts, an unbalanced discussion is a bit unusual. He talked about making sure the users sort of felt comfortable, especially when new users came to the site. And an unbalanced discussion forum, he felt, was one where people would be reluctant to want to contribute, especially as new users. And he described that as happening when there were a lot of posts, when there was just a ton of activity, where it just felt so it might feel insulated to somebody who first came to the who just came to the site. And so it might be too much, a time when there's just too much activity, he may want to go in and moderate the discussion a little bit. And the other thing he wanted to look out for what he called dud posts. These are when somebody posts something but to which nobody replies. In other words, it's essentially like an announcement of some sort. And that's a problem that he felt would maybe make somebody feel like it was a dead forum in which nothing was really going on. So he was looking out for this. But how did he really know that this was the case? Because he'd gone in and moderated before. Well, he used his gut to make that decision. He participates on the forum himself. He looks in on the forum, and if it feels like there's too much of it, then he'll step in and do something. But that relies on him being party to the site, being constantly involved. But more importantly, he didn't have any idea what these numbers were. He didn't spend any time with those numbers, and so the previous two solutions involved knowing what some of these values were, having some familiar with the data. So how was he going to even find that out? So what we did is we started out with the same sort of solution, but we used a very conservative estimate and just said maybe it's a very huge range. And if he had got high, he would go and investigate. He'd say, okay, I'll go see if discussion is sort of getting out of control. And if you find that, oh no, my gut tells me this is fine, he would then go and adjust the value. He would modify the value to reflect what his interpretation was of the information. And really what this interaction amounts to is just moving those thresholds. If, I'm using the graph from the CPU load to illustrate this, but since the data value is fixed, the pulling the slider down is like moving moving the ignore boundary up. So I'm going to walk up here and show this. So the data value is fixed, so pulling this down is like dragging this ignore boundary up. Likewise, if he were to move it up and say, you know what, there's something going on here, you're not telling me, I'm going to make sure that next time this happens, this is a important situation, he drags it up, it's actually just bringing the attend boundary down. And so after a while, he would do this, and it would end up reflecting his experience with the website more and more. But to answer your question, the thing that he really wants to look out for is that this problem is building. That it's not just that it's getting close, but that it's building so that he can nip it in the bud. So that is exactly where the graph would come in handy, like Ethan had pointed out. But we still want to, we still want to use the sort of try to make it an evaluation. So we'll add the same sort of boundaries, and like I said before, once it dips below one of the once the data is past one of the boundaries, might as well be at the boundary. But the other thing is that a graph, as we said sort of before, that there's too much detail in them. We just needs to make a quick evaluation. So a lot of the detail is extraneous, and so we can downsample the data. Oh, it fell down. Sorry, Henry. Thanks. So we can downsample that data, and we end up with a much more simplified graph of what's going on. But we also want to be able to predict how soon he's going to need some attention. And so I tried to offer him a sort of forecast of what heed would be in the near future. I tried to look at some really clever learning systems that would do a good job with long-term data, but wasn't successful. So I just used a Kalman filter to at least give him a sort of short-term forecast of the data, and change the display to to reflect both of that, to show the current value, the history, as well as the forecast, and represent occupancy likelihood in this sort of grid with a grayscale. But this display is still takes quite a bit of screen real estate, and it still has its biggest problem is that the current value is a bit not occluded, but it isn't really obvious. So we want to know, he still needs to know what the current situation is. So I created this little animation, sort of shows the relationship between this graph view and the sort of slider view we were looking at before. And shows that, it highlights the current state, it shows how the data is changing and how it's likely to change in the future. It's intended to sort of convey motion, sort of similar to that cartoon, that method of drawing comic books where a ball is flying through the air and you have little motion lines behind it. This is intended to sort of evoke that as well, and uses consistently interpreted the direction which something was changing pretty readily. And so now this sort of display also actually adds another step to that delving process. The user can see what the situation is, what the evaluation of the situation is, and then expand the display to sort of get a sense of how it's changing before then digging in deeper. This is some actual data from the access interference test that we did with the user, in which we were looking for posts. But what's sort of interesting here is that I've always shown the attend boundary at the top and the ignore boundary at the bottom. But in this case, he cares when people aren't posting. That was this issue of user interference. And so it's actually important when that number gets low, not when it gets high. But obviously it's trivial to invert the actual display and make sure that heed is always oriented with high heed at the top for sort of a consistency, to maybe better see how this historical data relates to the actual data. If we flip the graph, it makes it a little bit easier to see how it's downsampled to this. But this inversion was a little bit confusing for this user and for a few others. So we added a little trick, to sort of a little interface element to remind them, what was high heed, what was low heed. I hate the red-green mapping, but it was what the user really remembered and could interpret, so we just used these little reminders. But after a while, he too disabled them. So our forum owner ended up learning learning quite a bit about his users' behavior with this. He ended up finding he would make these adjustments and then actually go in and look at the configuration file and see where these values were, and actually find out sort of how much people are posting, and it gave him a much better sense of what was actually going on in his site. So much so that he ended up building his own version of the display that I had nothing to do with. He just simply rewrote the configuration file. He instrumented his website even more and used it to learn about all sorts of other aspects of his of the website and how it was used, which was a pretty sort of exciting result. So the last story I want to tell you about is about the chief veterinarian at a very large animal shelter. Excuse me. So there are some situations people wish they could monitor for, but they're just too complicated, and this is one of them. The chief veterinarian also has a great many responsibilities. He's not just a veterinarian and has to care for the animals, but he's also an administrator, and he has a lot of sort of budgeting duties and personnel duties. He also has to, ends up testifying in court cases in which he's had to talk about animal abuse. So he has an enormous amount of work to do. And this is a very large animal shelter. The problem that he's particularly concerned about is infectious disease outbreak at the shelter. This sort of infectious disease outbreak is a problem not just because he cares about the well-being and welfare of the animals, but it's very expensive when there's a disease outbreak. So he wants to try to identify the fact that an outbreak is about to happen and try to nip that in the bud as well. So the reason outbreak happens is because at the shelter the animals are kept in close quarters, which unfortunately can spread the disease, but is necessary because they want to try to rescue as many animals as possible. They also, as a result, have very limited space for isolation. Any room, any kennel that's reserved for isolation is another kennel in which they can't rescue an animal. But the animals get sick from time to time. They'll catch and they'll come in with an infectious disease to the rescue, but it doesn't mean an outbreak is going to happen. It just means that the animal is sick. An outbreak is when it starts spreading and there's rapid infection between many animals, which is something that's definitely happened to them in the past. So if the disease seems to be spreading, there are some mitigating actions that he can do. He can call for thorough sanitizing of a room which the animals are kept, and which they call nuking a room. But before he calls for that, which is both very expensive, it's very time-consuming for the volunteers, of which they never have enough. Anyway, he wants to be certain that all the animals that are in that room are not carrying the disease, either because they've been infected and are now immune or haven't gotten the infection yet. So he wants to be certain of that. But it's a really difficult problem for him to even determine that, which is in part because many of these infectious diseases have symptom-free gestation periods. So some of these gestation periods can be a week and a half long, and the animal will be contagious to other animals, but nobody knows that they've got the illness yet. Even if somebody notices that there are some symptoms, the animal isn't necessarily immediately brought for care, and there's so many volunteers that information doesn't really get around very easily. Furthermore, even if an animal is cared for, are diagnosed by one of the vets, there's so many vets that all those people don't necessarily communicate that kind of information with one another. So the way in which he would know is he'd have to actually walk by the isolation room all the time, recognize that there's an animal there, and recognize that it's a new animal being there. So the other way in which you could know is you could go through the records that they have for veterinary care. But there's a lot of them, and he does not have time to go through the new records every single day. And lastly, the problem gets made even more complicated because the animals get moved around. They're in one kennel one day and they get moved to a different one on another day. The volunteers have to sort of make these decisions based on if some animals are not getting along with one another, or one seems to be particularly uncomfortable in one kennel. So they get moved around, and so just the act of actually investigating this problem is really difficult and very time-consuming. So he needs to know when it's valuable to even go investigate this problem, where he's going to end up dedicating quite a bit of time just to figure out if there's an outbreak about to happen or beginning to happen. So essentially the importance of him going and investigating this is based on the number of incidents that have occurred in each room. So the display we made for him tells him if the disease is spreading through the shelter by showing him how many rooms are showing an infection, are showing a likelihood of an infection having been there. If an animal is diagnosed with the illness, every room it's been in for about the last 10 days needs to increase its likelihood for being infected, but adjusted for how many days since it's been there. And to determine all this, we need to know which animals have been diagnosed and then where they all have been. So luckily, that kind of information is stored in those veterinary records and in the animals' sort of private records for the at the facility, and those are stored in an online sort of medical record system. But it's a proprietary system, and so the data isn't really readily available, but we can parse it by hand, and luckily one of the volunteers was willing to do that for us. So if each incident sort of increases the likelihood of the room being infected, after several days that likelihood diminishes because now either all the animals have gotten sick or they're likely already immune. So if the likelihood gets high enough in any room, then it's worth his time to investigate that situation. And the more rooms that get high, and the more likely it is that he may have an outbreak on his hands, and he may have to make time to investigate and make some very important decisions. So what was interesting actually about this is that he didn't read the display as time for me to go investigate. He knew, he recognized that, but he also said, doesn't it also tell me the danger that any of these rooms are in infecting new animals going in? If I could just put this information outside of every door, then all the volunteers would know, and when they would actually maybe take preventative measures, they'd be more careful in that room. They might decide that there's enough danger in that room that they won't put a new animal in there, they'll put them in a different room. And I thought that was interesting, that he ended up mapping this sort of heed to something else, to in this case, to danger. And that he saw it as a way of actually not just increasing his own awareness, but increasing the awareness of many other people involved in the site at the animal shelter. So from all these stories and from all this work, this all leads me to describe what I think is needed in order to monitor a situation effectively. First, the observer, or the person who's going to do the monitoring, must identify and describe the situation of interest to them in terms of some set of indicative conditions. Next, they need a way to quickly perceive that situation as an evaluation in some way. And then they need a way to investigate the situation, delve into it and analyze more. And finally, they need a way to refine and modify their understanding of the situation, refine and modify the situation based to reflect their changing understanding or the changing situation. I've sort of tried to make the case that with each of these stories that alarms and dashboards and reports aren't sufficient, that they're analytical tools, and that in the case of all four situations, the users would have benefited from, or do benefit from, some kind of additional tool to support making evaluation. That evaluation is necessary because all these people have many responsibilities and must constantly make decisions about where to direct their attention. And the closer a situation is developing, the more important it becomes to pay attention to it. And so that tools that aid in making those evaluations quickly will help make monitoring easier. Thank you. Thanks all for listening. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks. Absolutely.
I'm sorry, you covered this earlier, but how is this distinct from a dashboard?
So, for one thing, that it simply becomes you can create, you can compact the display on and to make a single indicator. Let me show you the, I think you may have missed the slide in the beginning about. Oh, no, please. So in this case, we can, this was a report in which an executive was looking at the performance of several clients, and we could just show this as a giant dashboard, or we can actually create a process by which we consistently summarize them all into a single display that becomes an individual indicator. And this sort of framework, actually, I didn't go into a lot of the detail of other things. I showed the OR and AND operation, but we have many other logical operators that allow users to describe much more sort of detailed descriptions. Well, I shouldn't say many more operators, two more operators. One is not. It's very important for a user to be able to sort of describe what's typical and then say, I care when it's not typical, which is just a matter of essentially inverting it, taking 1 minus the value. And then they need sort of sensor operators, not SEN, but CEN, SOR operators, to be able to say, I care when this happens except when this other thing is happening. So they need so I have something called AND NOT, which isn't exactly NAND, but it works by essentially suppressing the highest heat value, and it takes the minimum of these values. It allows the user to define a situation in terms of mitigating circumstances. That's how it's different than a dashboard. I don't know if that helps, but it also requires less mental effort to parse. So
Your server example of the massive dashboard versus the indicator also shows the...
the dashboard shows raw data, and this is intended to show an evaluation of the data.
Which you could do on a thing called a dashboard.
Right.
And you largely created that for all these people, is they have this new dashboard thingy that they can look at that is now a lot more evaluative than the purely analytical thing that they used to have to rely on.
Absolutely. And the most effective dashboards are the ones that sort of highlight what's important in them, that draw your attention to the stuff that's happening in that's being shown on the dashboard that might be relevant to you. But in order to do that, the dashboard has to have some sense of relevance ahead of time. And so the people who develop the dashboard can do a great job of capturing what's going to be relevant to the users of the dashboard by studying those users. But this allows the users themselves to define it.
I don't care about my car's speed unless it's outside of this particular range in this particular area. I never care about my oil unless it's too hot.
Yeah.
So you gray all of those. Note, there is trouble.
Yeah.
Well, so following up on that point, it's kind of an interesting. Can you comment on how important the cropping actually is? Because humans are actually relatively good, in fact, amazingly good at looking for ranges and interpreting. Given that you've already compressed it to single dimension, what if you just left it from 0 to 100 and you didn't crop what I think you were calling the heat region?
Yeah, and you mean compacting it sort of just down to that one line, and then just leaving that whole?
So you do two compactions as far as I can tell, right? One
right.
is you compress time and you get rid of time in many of these cases. And then the second thing you do is you crop the ignore and the top and the bottom part of that.
Exactly.
I'm particularly interested in how much you gain by cropping the top and bottom off, as opposed to just letting the thing go really high or really low, because that does provide you with more information.
It does, absolutely. But what the information that it's providing you, I'll walk over here. The information that it's providing you is essentially analytical in nature. You're already, if you're being told that it's gotten super high, you're apt to start trying to interpret it, trying to understand it. This is actually just trying to let you know that you need to go find out if it's super high or not. The distinction is about how when this sort of activity is taking place. Is the activity first taking place and you're deciding this is how you're going to spend your time, or you're going to go to that important meeting, or then the activity is about analyzing the problem, understanding it, understanding how high it is that a serious problem, all that. That involves quite a bit of sort of cognitive effort. You want to understand, you want to be able to sort of distinguish those two, and that's where what I'm sort of advocating for is that we need something that helps us make the decision to go do that, to start interpreting it.
So maybe the follow-up question to that then is, for each of these domains, was there really a hard threshold at which I would go attend to it? Or, because most of the scenarios I would envision would say, it's always a trade-off in time, whether I go attend to something. And there's a continuum of, those things like shooting through the roof, I'm going to drop everything I'm doing right now and go attend to it, whereas if it's just above the threshold, I can probably wait 5 or 10 minutes.
What I would say is that if you've said that it's just above the threshold, then that threshold isn't properly set, that it might still need some adjustment. You're basically saying it's not important enough for me to drop everything and go do it. That means to me that it's actually below sort of maximum heat. And if you're saying that you care when it's really shooting through the roof, then I would actually say that it's not so much about making the decision based on the actual graph of the data, but actually making the decision and setting the thresholds in the first derivative of the data. So basically creating a new sensor from other sensor values. So the thing is that people actually are really good, in my experience, at actually describing what they want to pay attention to. I didn't show this, but I found that if I asked a person both of these questions, inevitably they could answer one of them. They could just tell me, what are you looking at? What are you looking for? By answering what are you looking at, it basically allows me to sort of help them define the situation that's important to them in a bottom-up fashion by starting with the sensor they're looking at and then sort of adding mitigating circumstances to it, mitigating conditions to it. And if they could tell me what they were looking for, they were describing the situation like unbalanced forum. what does that mean? And then they would start describing the conditions that led to that, the conditions that were meaningful to recognizing that was an unbalanced form. And so then we could build that situation description in a top-down fashion. Yeah.
This reminds me so much of Tufte's small multiples and his example of the hospital chart that he did, where there were many, many sensors that he presented on a normalized each one of them, and actually did display a time series instead of smushing a time series. Can you kind of compare and contrast?
Well, I have to admit that my recall for Tufte's work in small multiples, I remember the picture with all the T-shirts on it, not the one you're talking about. So I'm afraid I'd have to actually go back and look it up a little bit. The importance of the time series is that in that case, it may have been that it allowed, I'm only speculating here because I don't remember, but it may have allowed the nurse or the doctor to make the interpretation based on how much things were changing. That again, this was about including first derivative into the sort of decision-making process. And in this case, you can actually further compact it by basically saying that a first derivative is just another sensor in this case, and we can add it to that. But the thing is it's not necessary to compact it. It's actually fine to show it just in a full dashboard with lots of these, and then letting a user look over them or even sorting them based on how high the heat is. So here's a miscellaneous one of many situations, and subject can look over them and just identify that, oh, you know what, this one is not only high, but it's increasing really rapidly. I should go look in on that one. It's not necessary to always compact them. It may be just as valuable to sort of set up a sort of mini dashboard or even a larger dashboard. I don't know if that answered your question sufficiently, but. Petra.
I was wondering how you deal with changing maxima. In the cases where you have a maximum threshold, it's obvious, but then in this example you showed the OR searches, you were sort of mapping 0 to 1 to the maximum value, but the maximum could be changing from one day to the next, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially what you're asking is that those maximums are changing because the situation is changing, the person's understanding of the situation is changing.
Well, if I understood your picture right, I thought the maximum was like how many users have logged in or are registered in this system or something like this, right? There could be a day where there's 100 new users and your maximum is higher than the previous day, right?
Absolutely. So the situation has actually changed. The world is in some way changed. And so that's actually another problem that we have with alarm systems. That, in fact, there's a great study by some people in the UK named Banbury and his colleagues, and what they found was that actually alarm systems fail in a lot of these large industrial plants because they're set for these values that are not actually appropriate to that factory or to that situation, as the factory now is moving through more and more product. And so they actually advocate it's very important that you have a system by which people can adjust their alarms. So what you're talking about is that maybe on one day it was perfectly fine that 50 users logging in is plenty and that's not a problem. But the next day there was a newspaper announcement, tons of people joined the site, and now he's going to care when less than 100 people log in. And so the thing is, the adjusting of the sliders allows him to actually adjust those thresholds. So to continually try to match what his experience is with the system. It says essentially that that's a never-ending process.
You almost need your own alarm, like another alarm for telling you to change your sliders, right?
Well, to some degree, but that would be, to some degree, the whole problem with alarms is they're telling go do this as opposed to saying go look into this. So maybe it would be more about identifying when they need to go look in on maybe adjusting their sliders as opposed to saying drop everything, go fix them. But some problems don't change just hour to hour, change day by day. They take quite a bit more time to sort of change, and the understanding of the user takes longer to change. But absolutely, there's this sort of problem that it's a never-ending adjustment process. But that adjustment happens in their mind already. It's just, is there a system that ends up enabling them to reflect that and sort of work as a cognitive artifact that helps remind them? Ethan? Yeah.
So you didn't talk explicitly about this, but I didn't see any visualizations around it. But it seems that at least some of these scenarios, you have kind of this bimodal thing where I care about if my logins drop below this number, and I care if they go above this other number. So there's almost an ignore band in the middle and a pair of heed regions, and then a pair of alert regions.
Exactly.
Did you explicitly describe any of that?
I didn't
stuff?
explicitly describe that, but actually I can definitely tell you about it. So that's actually just an or combination of those two, the high and the low, saying I care when things are really high or when things are really low. So just make an or combination of the two, and I'll elect the higher one. So when the data has gotten way up high, then it'll so basically it means that in between the two ignore boundaries, it'll be low for both, and then as it moves through one of the two attend boundaries, it'll become higher.
Right. So when you say it'll be low for both, you mean it'll be just basically right down on the bottom?
Yep. Exactly. Excuse me.
Yeah, that's a good example to sort of get across the difference between evaluation and analysis, I think. Because you don't get anything from you get very little just from that one data point for the evaluation, for the analysis, but you get
So the big takeaway I wanted to really push is that people have to constantly have to make these tactical decisions about how they're going to use their time, where they're going to put their attention, and we need tools that help guide that, but don't force it. So, like we said with alarms, that it's not about telling you, go do this. It's about saying, maybe go look at this. Frank?
It's very amazing to looking for these pictures, but two things I want to comment. Looking for one picture, I want to get some information. I see there's current position, but what's the trend? Which direction are moving away? This is one I see. I would say have some direction on this picture and show us where is the direction they are moving, up or down. Second one is how fast they are moving. So you may have different coloring to show out this is moving very fast or very slow, and which direction they are moving. It's kind of just to comment.
No, that's actually a fantastic point. And actually, I've purposely avoided adding any other color mappings because I wanted to sort of leave that open for some future work. I think there's actually an opportunity, exactly like you said, to add additional information about how fast things are moving using a color mapping to maybe identify things as sort of hotter and colder, but in which direction that they're going. But there's an intention here that they're always oriented the same way, so that if you sort of read left to right and up and down, you can see things that are sort of moving this way, which give you a sense of how they're moving. But the question of how fast they're moving is actually a very important one. And something that I've avoided a little bit here. So I didn't tell you what the time distance is between here. There's a dimension of time here, but there's nothing sort of said in between here. And in some cases, that is something hour by hour, day by day, minute by minute, second by second. It's not there. Now the actual display ended up actually having some labels here that indicated how much time there was in between them. But the thing is that two different heat displays next to one another could have different timescales. So one that seems to be growing really rapidly might actually be just growing over the course of the week, as opposed to one that right next to it that is just changing second by second and may not seem to be growing very quickly. And making that distinction is very important, but it tends to map to what I found was that users didn't end up having a real problem with that. They ended up knowing that the problems that they were paying attention to had a time scale. They knew that these things changed either very quickly or very slowly, and so that didn't bother them. But it's still actually a really important point and something that will definitely have to be addressed more in sort of future work, looking at this and trying to understand how to compare things that really do happen at different time scales and compare them together.
So to follow up on that, if you yield that trends are important, then the main thing you're benefiting from your particular representation is space compression.
That's right.
Could I get you to speculate on perhaps behavioral differences you might have expected? So I don't know if you did sort of an A/B type comparison, because it looked like in a couple of these case studies they were very rich, but they went from having no representation of the data to your representation of the data.
Yeah.
Could you speculate if they got the traditional whatever timeline representation of the data,
Yeah.
would you expect behavior would have been different in reacting to information?
I can't. Well, I'd like to try to speculate, but I'm not. I'm certainly not sure. To some degree, it matters if the person is monitoring something very technical, and it also matters essentially sort of what their role with regard to the information is. So, for example, the server, the CTO is also the systems administrator. He will respond to the graphs very well. Much of his work involves looking at this. He's very involved in the very detailed, the nitty-gritty. But the CEO, who works at a much higher level, she wouldn't necessarily benefit from the graphs. And in fact, from my experience of working with her, very few of her reports have graphs. They have some numbers that she looks at, and she'll sometimes copy them out into Excel and maybe do a couple of comparisons, but not very much. So for her, in her case, I don't think that necessarily the graph will have a graph or more traditional sort of display would be just as meaningful. But I don't know, for example, with the chief veterinarian, whether or not he would benefit more from having sort of graphs showing how frequently there were infections and how often that got spread and so on, because I don't know. I assume he has quite a bit of technical training and must view them similarly, but I don't actually have any way to know.
It is a very nice compact representation.
And I think it's actually, I think it's kind of neat is that you can end up actually mapping this representation to other things. So for example, just sort of off the top of my head, if you imagine a cell phone dashboard, that when you bring it up, it shows you a bunch of different information, but it shows you it all relatively consistently. What if the battery indicator got bigger as the battery got lower? But I may be a person who just drives between home and work, and I've got a charger everywhere. I don't really care until it gets down to 5% or 10%. So I might want to sort of shrink it when it's at. But other people who travel a lot more, who have to get on planes, they care more about being able to have that battery. And if it's getting low, getting down to 50%, then maybe it should be bigger and sort of show them that more, give them the ability to sort of make those adjustments and changes. Just like having you've got an appointment coming up. Maybe that should be much bigger if it's sooner. Yeah.
Are there situations where you think that this would not be appropriate?
Absolutely. I think it's not appropriate for data that changes incredibly rapidly and has to be monitored extremely carefully. I mean, offhand, I don't have any particular examples to give you. I'd like to. Yeah. Well, actually, the stock market is an interesting example. That comes up often. People say, could you use this for the stock market? And I'm not sure because I'm not an investor and I don't understand how often investors have to look in on a portfolio. I know that you can set stop orders and stuff like that, or stop loss orders and stuff. So that it seems like it's an extremely analytical process. And so the relationship of investors to that data can be very so analytical that maybe this is not meaningful.
I think there's some opportunities here. I don't study that very closely, but some of my friends do, and I've seen them. I think there definitely is heat areas based on past performance. If it's above a certain range over the last 5 years, then suddenly it enters into this. So I think there is some potential there.
Yeah, but I wanted to follow up. Do you think that the display actually increases situation awareness, or does it in fact decrease situation awareness?
So what I saw is it seemed that there was an increase, and the way in which I knew that was that first of all, I should to some degree define situational awareness. I'm sorry, the title sort of almost made me have to do that, but I skipped it. Situational awareness is a field of study that's been primarily promoted by Micah Ensley. And situational awareness she describes as sort of these 3 levels of awareness. That the first level of situational awareness is really just sort of knowing the numbers, knowing the data. The second is sort of being able to understand sort of what it means. And the third is when you can sort of predict and you can see what's sort of coming down the pike. You have this awareness that something's going to happen soon. So there seemed to be, in some cases, there was an increase in the first level of situational awareness, like with the forum owner, that he didn't have any idea what the numbers were, but he did know sort of he had a level 2 sort of situational awareness about what was happening on the form because of his interaction. That was sort of his gut. And so he was actually using it to increase his level 1 situational awareness. The user the CEO and the CTO both actually increased their sort of level 2 situational awareness. They understood better about how these things were doing. And then the vet actually was using it in some ways to actually sort of look forward to, and so in some ways he'd increase his level 3 situational awareness. The biggest problem with situational awareness at this point is that it's still really hard to study and to know for sure that awareness has been increased. And so you've got to try to sort of look for indicators, and so that's why this is isn't quite so numerically studied. I don't know, did that answer your question?
Yes, sort of. I was just thinking, like, in safety critical situations, that a person's ability to react to a changing situation is really key and important.
Mm-hmm.
And studies in, like, autopilot situations, it's very dangerous because pilots actually have less awareness about the status of the plane. And so when an alarm goes off, like, oh my God, what's going on?
Yeah.
They don't really know.
Yeah, exactly.
And I imagine the same thing happens with this, is that once you hit a certain threshold, unless you really understand the mappings underneath it, you don't know what's actually happening in the situation.
So one of the things that's going on here is that it's actually, I'm just really not saying get rid of dashboards, get rid of alarms. Use this with them, so that there still is a need to be able to say, there's, pull up the plane, which I always think is so interesting about alarms in airplane cockpits, is that they don't just go off. Especially the collision avoidance stuff actually gives you a command, which I think is really interesting, as opposed to like a smoke alarm. But now I lost my train of thought. I lost it. I'm sorry. I was answering. Sorry. Something getting serious enough that you've got to respond. So there's still a need for alarms. You still need an alarm, but hopefully this actually allows you to maybe interact with the alarm system. That this ends up helping define those alarm thresholds, and it lets you know when something's gonna happen or that something is getting close to happening, so that you've got some idea beforehand.
Looking at this first and second derivative seems like a crucial aspect of that, or likely in many cases.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can you expose the underlying algorithm that computes the value?
That computes the
the value.
yeah, it's gonna
like number of posts divided by replies, or if it's first
Oh,
derivative.
it's not even, well, no, it's just setting thresholds. It's just setting the line and then doing a transformation in between. It's just what function you use to transform in between isn't defined. It's up to the user. So, for example, the gas gauge, that it's not as important, that it certainly doesn't decrease linearly, that a change between half a tank and one tenth below half a tank is not the same as the change between the last 10%. So you might need a sort of a exponential function instead. But this might look familiar to other people, to some of you, because this is essentially the same definition as a fuzzy set. So in some ways, this is applying fuzzy set theory to interaction. And this sort of transformation function in fuzzy set theory is called a hedge. And all the same sort of hedge stuff applies.
One thing I'm thinking is very interesting. Let's say this one, you are monitoring real-time data. Another side is we have a data store. They have huge history data there.
Mm-hmm.
And you may want to apply it onto these data. There were one particular factor is about how many data you collected at a point to support your index. So you have 100 something about that moment to support your base index, or just to have one incident. So that's another change.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a wonderful way to sort of classify sort of lots of different things. You can use it sort of as a measure of classification in that way.
I think it's because I saw your function. The function is t. Just the one.
Yeah.
I'm assuming.
It really could be anything. I mean, one of the things one of the things that this sort of function can be is it can actually be based on something very abstract, like the words people use. So that if in a form you can just make a giant mapping of different words that require more attention than others. So if people are just talking about cameras and gadgets or whatever, it may be low. But if people start talking about bombs or something, it may be it's more important that you go pay attention to that, so that you can apply you can end up using just sort of any function, but it's an evaluation in the end.
Okay, if there are no more questions now. Let's thank Conrad again, and anybody who wants, we're going off to lunch over next door. Anybody who wants to join us is welcome to join us. So,
Thank you. Thank you all for